First of all, thank you both for getting on the Zoom.
Yeah, sure.
These producers have asked us to investigate the origins of COVID, to go and hunt down Dr. Anthony Fauci and ask him a bunch of tough questions.
Gotcha.
And if we get anything wrong, I'm going to be committing career suicide as a director, and I'll probably never work again.
Even if you get everything right, people are going to hate you for this documentary.
It doesn't scare me to enter this conversation if it's dangerous. I do need your help to get the research right. So that's really the job, and it starts tonight because
sure.
I have to go to D.C. in a couple days.
I'm just going to jump right in. Let's look at this clip, right? Remember when Fauci went on Face the Nation that time?
Yeah.
They're really criticizing science.
He's repeatedly said
because I represent science.
He is the science. People who have been tracking this story believe that he does represent science. Everything wrong with science.
But the thing is that everything about the pandemic has been so shit-coded and politicized from the very beginnings.
Yeah.
Fauci does not love you, I guarantee it.
It's not popular opinion. This is not mainstream thought.
It's not broadcast by the mainstream news media because...
Have you seen the COVID misinformation page?
It's crazy, man.
Yeah, why don't we go there right now? Let's go through this page and figure out what has nothing to do with Anthony Fauci. We've got meteor origin, that a meteor carried the pandemic.
Wow, man.
Like Deep Impact?
We've got drinking cow urine and applying cow dung to your body can cure COVID.
And
nothing to do with Fauci. May be interesting to try.
I guess I'll try anything once.
I'm okay, man.
Now we're getting closer. Washing groceries in Purell.
Oranges in the sink.
He didn't say to do it.
Don't forget to disinfect your trunk.
Yeah.
But he also didn't say not to do it.
People should not be walking around with masks.
Gotcha.
Yeah, that was one of my favorites.
And loosely related to Fauci, you've got 5G.
I'm a guinea pig.
You've got the whole pandemic scandal.
Mickey Willett.
Fauci and Bill Gates. QAnon. We've got whatever Fox News said about Fauci.
Like a Rorschach test.
Thing they show serial killers and kindergartners.
We will not comply.
Thank you, and keep the faith.
Wow.
How do you not be cynical in this world, man?
Okay, right here at the top, directly related to Fauci, the consensus among virologists is that the most likely origin is natural crossover from animals.
Right. Feel sorry for bats, man. They get a bad rap.
Coronavirus jumps from an animal to a human,
Maybe,
probably in a wet market.
maybe not.
Where they
Did it come from a lab? Isn't that what we want to know?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Totally consistent with a jump of a species from an animal to a human.
Right. This is just nature.
I mean, the paper will be available. I don't have the authors right now, but...
Okay, Wikipedia says the resurgence of the lab leak and other theories was fueled in part by the publication in May 2021 of early emails with Fauci.
There were like thousands of emails, documents, grant proposals.
Who knows what else?
Honestly, I have no idea, but I should tell you guys that right after the pandemic, I got approached to direct a movie about Fauci.
Wow.
It was not about COVID, it was about AIDS in Africa and how he saved a lot of lives, and I have his contact, so I'm thinking that I'd just start writing him an email. Here are the movies I worked on. I was supposed to do one about you, but you did one for Nat Geo and for PBS and not mine. And now I'm looking at this COVID thing, and there seems to be a lot of controversy.
You do not know what you are talking about.
All the evidence is pointing that it came from the lab, and there will be responsibility for those who funded the lab, including yourself.
So according to Rand Paul, Anthony Fauci is Frankenstein from the 1931 movie.
He's alive! What we're alleging is that gain-of-function research was going on.
We got to ask him to explain gain-of-function research.
Where you're looking at a deadly pathogen and you're figuring out what could make it more deadly. There was a tremendous controversy.
It's biological warfare.
Is it biowarfare? Is it biodefense? Whatever it is, it was dangerous.
Why were we doing it in the first place?
Did you help the U.S. government spy on China?
Are you responsible for killing millions of people?
Actually, a serious question. Did you do it? Are you a sociopath?
Yeah, you probably shouldn't write any of that.
So what am I going to sign it? Like,
How about thank you, Dr. Fauci?
Thank you.
thank you, Dr. Fauci.
Thank you for your years of service.
Right. I'm sure he loves to hear that.
Thank you, Dr. Fauci.
Thank you, Dr. Fauci.
Thank you, Dr. Fauci.
All right. I sent it.
Nice.
I mean, I think there's about a 10% chance that he's going to write me back, so let's see what happens.
You've reached out to Dr. Fauci. This is not a hit piece. This is not a hit piece.
But it's tricky, like everyone's going to have an opinion.
You won't get the disease, but you can carry the disease and you can spread it, you dumb
But they
fuck.
told us, but they
You're a dumb fuck, you're not listening. You're a dumb fuck, you're not listening. You're a dumb fuck.
Yeah.
Just because you've been
I don't think people understand how stressful this job is.
This could potentially be one of the biggest stories of our time.
And I hope that you never have to go through COVID because it is evil.
20 million people may be dead. There could be up to $25 trillion in damages. And if this could have been prevented, I mean, the whole world has a right to know.
Dr. Fauci, thank you for doing all you can to keep America healthy.
I mean, look at all these celebrities.
You are America's scientist.
They worship this guy.
Anthony Fauci's work has saved literally millions of lives.
We are breaking down this concept of idolatry.
Yeah, I mean, it's dangerous when something as big as science can be falsely represented by one man.
In the end, very few people have firsthand experience working with him. And almost none of those people will talk to you.
I was told I need to talk to Dr. Robert Redfield. He was the director of the CDC at the time of the pandemic.
He's the highest placed person who's been outspoken on Fauci.
Patient has had long COVID since 2020.
His whole career got turned upside down from the pandemic, and now he's back practicing as a doctor and specializes in long COVID.
Currently being treated with antihistamine. My own view is that this virus was not of natural origin. It was an act of scientific arrogance.
He's blamed in the early days for a lot of the problems with the pandemic. But then there's other reports that say that he told Fauci that this was most likely a lab leak, and he was excluded from all these secret teleconferences that were happening.
He's also a colleague of Fauci's for 40 years. It's incredible.
And then in 2018, they get put in the same orbit again when Redfield gets appointed to be the director of the CDC.
One of the reasons I accepted the CDC job is that I have 12 grandchildren, and I just have a very strong premonition that our nation is going to have a terrible, terrible pandemic. New Year's Eve, 2019. I got a phone call from my team in China, and I was informed that there was 27 cases of an unspecified pneumonia. From the beginning, my antennas were up. I called my counterpart, George Gao, who was the head of the CDC in China, and he said it came from the wet market. And viruses go from animals to humans. When you look at SARS, it went from a bat to a civet cat to humans. MERS came from a bat to a camel to humans. It takes them a long time to learn how to transmit effectively in the human species. And this virus immediately understood how to replicate effectively in humans. It was clear from the information I was getting that there were literally thousands of patients, if not more, and getting some intelligence feedback that this was a major issue. Everyone, without any critical analysis, attributed this to the wet market, and nobody went back and looked at people that had nothing to do with the wet market. And a couple days later, George Gao called me back, and he said, Bob, we have hundreds of cases, and it has nothing to do with the wet market. So we knew by the first couple days in January that this wet market story, in my view, was a ruse. I called the National Security Council, and I told them that there was a situation in China, and then I called Anthony Fauci. And I told him, as a clinical virologist, this virus was way too infectious in humans right out of the gate. I felt strongly that it had been educated in the laboratory.
And Redfield knew that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was the most famous lab in the world for researching coronaviruses.
So the idea that this virus came from a lab is very reasonable.
We were talking about it, and Tony argues that my premise is wrong, that I believed it came from the lab, and it was clear the aggressive support for the wet market being the source. I thought that Tony should embrace scientific investigation, but Tony only considered a single hypothesis. It was spillover, 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 spillover. I was perplexed.
Redfield thought this virus could have been the product of gain-of-function research, which is genetically mutating viruses to make them more infectious and deadly. Fauci had been a champion of this type of research for decades.
For gain-of-function research, I mean, Tony is the poster boy. He believed the best way to prepare for the next pandemic is to predict it by creating it. If we can create the pathogen that can negatively impact humanity, then we can prevent it. But this is a big difference between Fauci and me, because I disagree with that logic. I think we should not be doing this gain-of-function research. We don't have the proper biocontainment in these labs, and that could cause a laboratory leak or accident. So it's very dangerous. Of course, Tony argued this was science. I've known and worked with Tony since 1981. Tony believed that science is supreme, and the more you do of science, the higher up the mountain you go. You know, Oppenheimer learned the hard way that there's a downside to science. Right? He learned the hard way. Tony doesn't see the downside to science, and that is a big problem.
It's interesting because it has jumped species likely from an animal source into the human.
If you go back, Tony's got a lot of airtime on tape.
Viruses emerge from animal reservoirs.
He was very aggressive in saying that this had to be natural spillover.
Probably in a wet market.
The White House Coronavirus Task Force stood up somewhere, I think in late January. We did invite Fauci to be part of it. Tony made it very clear that it was spillover, 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 spillover. We obviously disagreed on the potential of origin in those meetings, and that's where the lines were drawn. But then I saw the papers that were published by the Wuhan lab. NIAID was acknowledged on the paper in 2014. That was evidence Tony had funded the Wuhan laboratory. And being an insider at the time, I said to myself, I mean, what's going on here? And I don't know the answer to that question.
Thank you, Dr. Redfield. I would now like to invite Dr. Anthony Fauci.
I can start off by putting it into perspective by telling you I often get asked, we have an influenza.
And when Tony spoke, I was just very shocked at how aggressive he was to try to take the leadership position on being the voice of the pandemic.
The kinds of things we're doing here right now.
I was only the head of CDC, which, by all accounts, was the leading public health position in the United States, until I got iced out. People argued that it was the White House. I don't buy that.
I've just been going through all these different documents. There's a lot of people who have been covering this for years now.
What I understand about Dr. Richard Ebright is that he is, in a sense, probably the most vocal critic of Anthony Fauci.
Richard, is it true that people call you Anthony Fauci's worst nightmare?
Yes.
From what I've read, it seems like he hates Anthony Fauci, and Anthony Fauci hates him.
And it's not even just about COVID. It's like been happening for the last 20 years between the two of them.
We had willful, deliberate misfeasance that likely caused a pandemic, killed 20 million, and cost $25 trillion. Against that context, it is unsurprising that individuals would prefer a lie.
Neil Harrison is a scientist at Columbia, and he was tracking COVID since the beginning.
Scientists don't generally like to criticize other scientists, and we really don't like to use the F word.
What's the F word?
Fraud. I said the F word.
And he's now helping a congressional investigation into the origins of COVID and the potential of a cover-up.
Hi, this is Emily Kopp. I'm a reporter with US Right to Know in Washington.
So Emily Kopp is a health reporter, and around 2021, she shifted into covering the origins of COVID.
I felt like I had a moral obligation to get answers.
She's been responsible for a lot of the Freedom of Information documents, and her main focus has been sort of piecing together the behind-the-scenes communications between Fauci and this group of scientists.
So I'm going to go see Charles Rixey. What do I need to know about him?
Rixey, he's part of this group called Drastic, which is this sort of decentralized investigative team comprised of scientists, web sleuths, and veterans.
That's me in the black shirt. I was really sick when I got COVID. And then a former Marine reached out to me and said, you should look into the origin of the virus. And from that date in 2020, I shifted my attention full-time to figuring out what the origin of the virus was.
He believes COVID was engineered in a lab.
On January 11th, the genome of SARS-CoV-2 was released by the Chinese.
This is the genetic sequence of the virus. Molecular biologists can look at these letters and they can compare these sequences to other similar viruses looking for differences. And they immediately found a huge difference.
Some aspects of it looked unnatural.
That section right in the middle, PRRA, that is something that they call a furin cleavage site. And that can have a lot to do with how infectious the virus is in humans. They could not find it in any similar viruses, and that was really suspicious.
The furin cleavage site stands out like a sore thumb.
So this furin cleavage site is right on the spike protein, and this is what makes the virus stick to human cells. So if they were using gain of function and they were modifying a virus in the lab, this is exactly what they would use to make it more infectious.
Every informed person knew at that point that lab engineering was a very real possibility, and discussions began immediately.
So on January 27th, there's another twist. Dr. Fauci is contacted over email by this scientist named Christian Anderson.
Christian Anderson is a virologist based in California who sort of started out as this whistleblower that the virus seemed unusual and might have resulted from a lab accident.
Christian Anderson came to him with a 2015 paper by Zhang Shi, who works at the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
And Anderson says it looks like a how-to manual for creating SARS-CoV-2 in a lab.
This is the paper connected to a scientist at the Wuhan lab. And if we scroll down here, you can see in the funding section, they cite 13 grants. All of those grants are connected to the US and the NIH, National Institute of Health. And 9 of those grants were signed by Anthony Fauci and the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease. I mean, Redfield saw the same connections weeks prior, and now random scientists like Christian Anderson are finding more of these connections on the internet, and they're directly emailing Fauci about it. And they all agree this furin cleavage site doesn't look natural.
On January 27th, when Christian Anderson emailed him about the furin cleavage site, Fauci says, if this is correct, then you should probably contact the FBI, because this could be suspicious and may be signs of engineering and may even be related to biological weapons research.
I would love to ask him about this email because I don't think it makes that much sense.
Why wouldn't he call the FBI? I mean, this is a guy who's been in government for 40 years, more. Why would he not call the FBI? And then, on January 31st, there's this paper from a group of scientists in India, Pradhan et al. And it points out not just the furin cleavage site, but there are other areas of this spike protein that don't look natural and
could be from HIV.
Wow.
Which is totally fucked up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that is frightening.
Wow.
In addition to the fear and cleavage site, these 3 inserts were suspiciously similar to spike protein of HIV.
At that point in time, Dr. Fauci began an email storm. He emailed other members of the United States government as well as outside scientists, urgently asking their opinions about laboratory origin.
And a lot of these panicked emails seem to be written to Sir Jeremy Farrar. Farrar is an extremely powerful scientist from the UK, and they seem to be back-channeling about how to handle this story.
Fauci and Jeremy Farrar consulted on how to address the optics, inviting scientists to an emergency teleconference to be held the next day on a Saturday.
You can look at the emails, like not a single email is written to Bob Redfield that night about any of this.
I considered both Jeremy Farrar and Fauci scientific colleagues. We may not go out to dinner every night, but we were scientific colleagues, and I thought there was mutual respect.
Redfield was not part of this February 1st teleconference that took place. It is unthinkable when there's a potential viral pandemic that the director of the CDC would not be part of this initial conversation.
So this emergency teleconference happens right after on Saturday, February 1st. And they have invited Christian Anderson, who had emailed Fauci earlier with his concerns that this may be a lab leak.
Anderson looped in Robert Gary, a Tulane close colleague of Anderson, and Andrew Rambo at the University of Edinburgh, and Eddie Holmes at the University of Sydney, who has worked very closely with the China CDC.
So all these guys are on this Slack. They're saying stuff like the virus became loaded for human transmission, exactly what you would expect from lab engineering.
The call appears to have been a shouting match between Anderson and Holmes, who had these suspicions about unusual aspects of the genome, and the gain-of-function virologists who had spent years saying that their work could not ignite a pandemic. We also know through Slacks that were exchanged during the call that there was some sort of quote-unquote big ask. But we don't know what the big ask was.
We don't know what was discussed on this call. We only have these Slacks. But a big ask was made.
And you look at these Slacks, whatever these dudes were asked to do, Anderson thinks it's hard to pull off.
Farrar, Collins, and Fauci, altogether they oversee about $72 billion in funding every year. So if you're a scientist and perhaps one of these gentlemen asks you to write something, you have an enormous incentive to write something that they will like.
Anderson and Gary had a very large grant proposal for a center of research on emerging infectious diseases in West Africa. That grant proposal was on Fauci's desk. In a very real sense, Christian Anderson and Robert Gary had $8.9 million to comply.
On February 3rd, there's another teleconference with Ralph Barrick and Peter Daszak. Both had received a lot of money from Fauci's agency, and Daszak had been out in the media promoting this and his nonprofit for years.
EcoHealth Alliance, what is it?
Well, we're a non-profit, a typical charity funded by federal government and other sources.
EcoHealth Alliance has an enormous budget from many different U.S. agencies, NIH, Department of Defense.
He does a ton of work at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. There were a lot of people in the scientific community who felt like Peter Daszak may have known more than he alluded to. I mean, I really wonder, did Anthony Fauci think that too?
The goal of this February 3rd meeting was to combat misinformation related to the origin of COVID-19. That was the stated goal. Immediately after this meeting, Pradhan et al., the first paper to publish the existence of 3 inserts suspiciously similar to the spike protein of HIV, a paper that was published just 72 hours prior, was withdrawn. under intense pressure.
Gone. Taken off the internet.
Wow.
After the teleconferences, while the virus was spreading around the world and beginning to kill a lot of people,
death toll from the coronavirus now topping 34,000.
All these scientists that had come together to speak with Fauci and Farrar and Collins, they write a bunch of papers that claim this couldn't have come from a lab and must have come from nature. So was that the big ask?
All the members of that teleconference published 33 articles.
There was a paper that stated that there was no evidence for laboratory engineering. There's a section called Figures and Data, and it's empty. There's no data and there are no figures.
Day after day, week after week, there was a different scientific paper.
It has the quality of a media campaign.
And then there's this one in The Lancet, which is one of the most prestigious scientific journals in the world.
The letter in Lancet's not even a scientific paper. I call it a wedding announcement. It's orchestrated by Jeremy Farrar. It's basically an article saying that anyone who thinks this virus came from a lab is a conspirator. And it's signed by over 20 very prominent scientists.
At the bottom of the letter, it says, "We declare no competing interest."
But Peter Daszak is the guy who writes the letter, so I have no idea what the Lancet is thinking, but that is a competing interest.
And then you have the proximal origin paper.
It was written by those guys from Slack.
And it is arguably the biggest one. The paper gets released and went viral.
It immediately gets something like 3 million views.
But I consider proximal origin very sloppy science.
This was propaganda. This was not science.
Then there's this press conference.
Investigation into whether the virus escaped from this lab in Wuhan. How active is that? And when
we're looking at it. They talk about a certain kind of bat, but that bat wasn't in that area. If you can believe this, that's what they're down to now is bats. But that bat is not in that area. That bat wasn't so.
And then there's another reporter who asks if this virus could come from a lab. And he directs that question to Anthony Fauci.
There was a study recently that we can make available to you where a group of highly qualified evolutionary virologists.
And this is where it gets really weird, because now Fauci says that there's this paper.
Bats, as they evolve, and the mutations that it took to get to the point where it is now.
And he's referring to proximal origin, the paper that was written by those guys from Slack.
Is totally consistent with a jump from an animal to a human. So, I mean, the paper will be available. I don't have the authors right now, but we can make that available too.
He said that he had just seen a paper that he didn't know much about or who the authors were.
I don't have the authors right now, but we can make that available too.
I think it'd be good to just rewind this for a second and listen to what he says here. Listen to this.
Totally consistent with a jump of a species.
It's not so much what he says, but what he didn't say.
Species from an animal to a human. So, I mean, the paper will be available. I don't have the authors right now.
He says he doesn't have the authors. Is he saying that because he legitimately is blanking on their names?
Let me have some water.
I know that Fauci is a very busy man, and as he said, he gets hundreds of emails a day. But I find it incredibly hard to believe
highly qualified
that he would not remember the names of people that he spoke to on the eve of the pandemic.
Well, I don't have the authors right now. But
it's not just, that he can't remember the names. It sounds like just something that he read, just like that came across his computer or that he just saw on the internet.
It feels really shady.
I certainly can understand the frustration of people, but my main role in the task force was to make recommendations to protect the health and the safety of the American people.
For me, it seems his entire management was not about serving the sick and dying. It was about serving and protecting the system that was responsible for the sick and dying.
And I would hope that people understand that that's the reason why we're doing what we're doing, and hopefully we'll put an end to this.